At 10:20 in the morning on June 4, 1942, sunlight poured down through the scattered clouds above the wide Pacific. Beneath that brightness, the surface of the sea mirrored a calm that hid destruction about to unfold. Four Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay in formation, their flight decks alive with the hum of aircraft engines, mechanics shouting and clanging metal. Then, out of the sky, shapes fell, a formation of American dive bombers, nose down at nearly 90 degrees, slicing through the light. In moments, the four proud giants of Japan's striking arm would become burning hulks. One sailor later remembered, it was as if the air itself was torn open. Within 6 minutes, much of Japan's naval power lay ruined. The question echoes across decades: how could 6 minutes alter an entire ocean? To grasp the weight of that moment, we must step back to the winter of 1941 to 42, when Asia and the Pacific had been swept into war. 6 months earlier, Japan had struck without warning at Pearl Harbor, destroying much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleships, but leaving the American aircraft carriers at sea and unharmed. The attack had not only plunged the United States into global conflict, but also unleashed a cascade of invasions. Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, Guam, and the Dutch East Indies fell in quick succession. Japan, believing itself pressed by Western embargoes and dependent on imported oil, saw its empire as a matter of survival. But behind the slogans of self-determination, coercion spread across newly occupied lands. Villages were stripped of rice, prisoners filled makeshift camps. On the American mainland, the months after Pearl Harbor were thick with fear, yet charged with determination. Seattle dockyards ran through the night. Housewives gathered scrap metal and rubber for recycling drives. The phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" painted walls and newspaper headlines. Factories that had once built automobiles now turned out aircraft by the hundreds. All the while, the Pacific remained haunted by defeat. The Philippines were under siege, and rumors of Japanese invincibility filled radio broadcasts. It was into this uncertain moment that intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor offered a thread of hope, a thread woven out of mathematics, intuition, and quiet persistence. Inside a small, humid building at Station Hypo, linguists led by Commander Joseph Rochefort worked 12-hour shifts, deciphering fragments of the Japanese Navy's main naval code, JN-25. The messages referred often to a place called AF. They could not tell where AF was, but it was clear that something decisive was being planned there. On Nimitz's suggestion, the codebreakers set a trap. Operators on Midway sent an open transmission that their water facilities had broken down. Within hours, a Japanese message confirmed that AF was short on water. What followed was an extraordinary reversal in the psychology of war. Instead of stumbling into Yamamoto's trap, the Americans now saw it forming in detail. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, calm to the point of austerity, kept his preparation quiet. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, would form his striking arm, despite being outnumbered in ships and aircraft. The key would be timing, placement, and discipline. As he later wrote, the essence of strategy is informed patience. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan's naval genius, faced complexities of his own design. Educated partly in the United States, he understood both the capacity and temperament of his adversary. He had opposed war with America, but having been overruled, committed himself fully to the fight. By early 1942, he sought to destroy the remaining U.S. carriers and compel Washington to negotiate peace. His plan was as ambitious as it was fragile. 4 carrier groups under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo would attack and seize Midway. A separate force would invade the Aleutian Islands to draw American forces north. The Japanese assumed that American morale was still brittle and their navy reactive. That assumption would prove fatal. Midway, a scattered atoll of coral and rock halfway between Honolulu and Tokyo, became the pivot of the Pacific. Barely 2 miles long, it was little more than a reef rim enclosing shallow lagoons, but its airfield and harbor grants were invaluable. Marines stationed there lived in conditions alternating between boredom and fear. One recalled the endless sound of surf and wind, until you heard the enemy, and then you wished only for the surf again. The first days of June brought tense calm. American crews readied bombers on the makeshift runways. Carrier task groups moved to their appointed ambush sites northeast of the island. Sailors went through final briefings, some writing letters that would never be posted. The Japanese, confident in their secrecy, advanced without imagining that the ambushers awaited them. Dawn, June 4th, 4:30 a.m., the radar operators on Midway picked up a cluster of incoming dots. The alarm spread like fire through radio circuits. Enemy planes inbound. Fighters scrambled from both island and carriers. Within an hour, the first Japanese bombs fell. Explosions shattered hangars, fuel tanks burned, black smoke spiraled into the morning. Midway's defenders lifted anti-aircraft guns skyward, firing tracers blindly through the haze. Despite the damage, the airfield remained serviceable. Nagumo's pilots returned convinced one more strike would smash the atoll completely. It was that report which drove Nagumo's fateful decision to rearm his reserve planes for another land attack, rather than keep them ready for possible American ships. Below decks, mechanics hurriedly swapped torpedoes for bombs. Deck crews, sweating in heat, handled volatile fuel hoses, unaware that within hours their decks would ignite under American bombs. Meanwhile, waves of American torpedo bombers and land-based aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet piecemeal. Their coordination was poor, their courage absolute. Flying low and slow, they entered a storm of flak and fighter fire. Plane after plane burst into flame, plunged into the sea. Of the 41 aircraft in torpedo squadrons 3, 6, and 8, only one pilot survived, Ensign George Gay, who later floated for hours, hiding under a seat cushion, watching the battle devour itself. His words would endure. "I saw Kaga burning like a match. I thought of all the men who had tried to shoot me down. It didn't feel like victory then. Yet those doomed attacks fixed the Japanese air cover at sea level. When, at 10:20 a.m., the dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived high above, the sky around the enemy carriers was open, unguarded. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's squadrons, noticed a Japanese destroyer moving at unusual speed, likely rejoining the fleet. He followed its wake and soon sighted the core of Nagumo's formation. His bombers dove. Moments later, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit almost simultaneously. The sequence lasted barely 6 minutes, but overturned months of planning and decades of imperial confidence. On each carrier, aviation fuel ignited airplanes armed for takeoff, and chain explosions turned steel decks into firestorms. At 10:25, the ocean glowed orange as rising smoke formed columns 15,000 feet high. Kaga's captain ordered abandoned ship. Crewmen leapt into oil-covered seas. On Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood momentarily silent, then whispered to his staff, "I must atone with the ship." He was compelled off hours later, reluctant but alive. The psychological fracture was complete. Hiryu, the one carrier not yet found, launched 2 retaliatory waves that struck the American force, crippling Yorktown. The damaged ship's engineers scrambled to restore power while her crew fought fires and flooding with astonishing calm. For a few moments, observers believed the carrier might survive, but the second strike ended that illusion. Yorktown became a drifting monument to endurance and was later torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. Even so, American reconnaissance soon located Hiryu, and by late afternoon, she too was aflame. Yamamoto, aboard his distant flagship Yamato, received the news with composed despair. He called off the operation at midnight, retreating into the dark Pacific. Midway had been lost. By dawn, the sea was littered with lifeboats and wreckage. American rescuers, cautious of submarines, retrieved survivors where they could. Most Japanese sailors were left adrift. About 3,000 men of the Imperial Navy were dead, along with over 300 Americans. The numbers, though uneven, underscored a shared tragedy. 2 nations watching their youth vanish into saltwater. Through June and July, journalists called Midway the revenge for Pearl Harbor, yet beyond triumph and vengeance lay a quieter meaning. The victory had depended not on overwhelming force, but on information and resilience. The battle marked the end of Japanese expansion, the boundary between early aggression and an approaching tide of retreat. US forces would soon take Guadalcanal, and the long, costly island-hopping campaign would begin. For Japan, the loss of 4 carriers and over 100 experienced aviators was irreparable. Despite building new ships, the training of aircrew could not match the wartime attrition that followed. As historian Saburo Ienaga later remarked, Midway did not end the war, it ended victory. Within Japan, censorship muted the news, calling the battle a minor setback. But families of missing sailors knew the truth. A widow in Kobe wrote in her diary that summer, "The radio speaks softly now. The sea has taken their voices for Americans. Midway triggered both pride and reverence." Commander Rochefort's intelligence team received no public acknowledgement until decades later. Their secrecy was their service. Nimitz, when asked about the victory, simply said, "They did their duty." The rest is chance, yet historians since have debated the balance of chance and design. How much belonged to code-breaking, to discipline, or to coincidence? The dive bomber's arrival, just when Nagumo's decks were loaded with fuel, was nearly miraculous. But miracles in war emerge from preparation combined with daring. Beneath the surface of strategy lies the personal scale of choice and fear. Consider Lieutenant Torpedo Squadron leader John Waldron, who disobeyed orders to search elsewhere, insisting his intuition pointed true. His entire squadron fell, yet his decision distracted Japanese fighters at the decisive hour. Most of his men died before age 30. Among the Japanese, Airman Tomonaga Joichi prepared for his final sortie from Hiryu with quiet fatalism. His aircraft damaged, but repaired enough for one more flight. Before taking off, he's said to have remarked, "If the gods still favor our emperor, may we meet again amid the clouds." He never returned. These individuals, separated by language and fate, were bound by the same narrow corridors of courage and doubt. Midway, in retrospect, reveals humanity in tension between obedience and intuition, between honor and survival. In military terms, Nagumo's hesitation to launch immediately upon receiving first reports of sighted American ships became the pivotal delay. In human terms, hesitation is an inevitable companion of command, the moment of weighing incomplete information with thousands of lives dependent upon it. The tactical lessons extracted from Midway shaped generations of naval theory. The primacy of air power over battleships, the indispensability of intelligence, and the importance of flexible command. But these technical readings risk emptying the event of its emotional resonance. The sound, the light, the sense of irreversibility. Veterans later described the water littered with burning oil, wings jutting from waves, and the eerie quiet once gunfire ceased. For each victor, a vanquished; for each order, an echo unanswered. Years later, as technological exploration allowed submersibles to map the seabed, historians and oceanographers found the resting places of Akagi and Kaga. Their steel hulls lie 4 miles down, shrouded in cold darkness, corals coating gun barrels, fish drifting through ruptured hangars. Viewing the images, one researcher whispered, "They still look ready to launch." It is as if the war sleeps but has not vanished, merely transformed into a memory mineralized by time. The broader implications of Midway stretch well beyond military history. It demonstrated the volatile balance between technology and decision, between the predictability of machines and the unpredictability of people. It suggested that no empire, however vast, can sustain itself through fear and expansion indefinitely. And it underscored the moral dimension of intelligence, the ethics of deception, surveillance, and calculated surprise that modern warfare would rely upon ever more heavily in later decades. Midway also shaped post-war reconciliation. Many of the Japanese officers captured or surviving the conflict later expressed admiration for Nimitz's conduct. When accepting Japan's surrender in 1945, Nimitz insisted upon dignity for his former enemies, understanding that peace could not endure upon humiliation. The same ocean that had been the theater of destruction became again the field of trade and exchange. Proof that even from catastrophe, continuity can rise. Today, to read the letters of pilots and sailors from both sides is to confront not ideology, but humanity's mirror. They wrote of missing home, of wanting to live, of fear of disappointing their comrades. One Japanese letter, recovered decades later from the wreck of Kaga, read, "Tell mother I kept my promise to see the world." The irony tears gently at the heart. He did see it, briefly, before the horizon folded over him. Standing on the quiet shore of what remains of Midway Atoll today, where albatrosses nest and the surf erases every footprint within hours, it is difficult to imagine the terror of that morning. The wind moves through tall grass where once bunkers crouched. Rusted fragments of artillery still face the sea, untouched since 1942. Visitors often speak of an uneasy calm, a sense that something immense has passed, yet left its shadow behind. If history is a record of choices under pressure, Midway is one of its purest specimens. Nothing about it can be reduced to fate. Everything about it reflects the perishable mixture of skill, preparation, and contingency. The outcome changed the strategic trajectory of the Pacific, yet it also exposed the narrow line separating mastery from disaster. It taught that foresight in strategy must be matched by humility in victory. Within those 6 minutes, the Pacific War's narrative bent toward reversal. For every culture, it is a reminder of the fragility of dominance and the enduring power of knowledge. The sea beneath Midway still carries traces of that lesson. That history, like the ocean, remembers in silence. Perhaps the closing reflection belongs not to admirals or historians, but to an observer who saw the formation of fate itself. Floating amid debris, Ensign George Gay looked at the dying ships and said later, "The water was calm. The sky had no answer." His words, quiet and unresolved, capture the paradox of Midway, how humanity's brilliance and blindness can coexist within a single heartbeat of time. And in that heartbeat, in those 6 minutes, the direction of the Pacific changed forever.